Hi everyone, we're going to continue here with population ecology, talking about our range of tolerance. So remember that each species has a set environmental conditions in which they are best survival and reproduction happen. But with that, there is an idea that all of these things coming together influence where that species is going to live. So those physical and abiotic factors, so temperature, humidity, soil chemistry, pH, salinity, and oxygen levels. But when those are interrupted, we can see that species can actually tolerate or survive in a range of different conditions. So if the conditions are too bad that they cannot survive, then we'll see a difference here. So it has to be just right. So if there's too much or too little of a certain factor, that species isn't going to be able to survive in that area. So if we take this example of temperature, so polar bears survive really well in those low temperatures. But if we put them in a higher temperature environment, we're not going to see them survive. So let's take a look at this graph and kind of comprehend of what we're talking about. So if we take a look right here, our optimum range, we can see that we have a lot of organisms here. So this is the right conditions and there's no stress on the organism, so that we have an abundance here. But once we keep going to a range, say if we're using temperature as an example, a little too low, there's a zone of stress here. We're going to see much less organisms. And same thing here, if we go to a zone of too high of a temperature, again, zone of stress, we're going to see fewer organisms. But if we keep going in that direction, either high or low in temperature, we're going to see that no organisms are present because they aren't able to survive here. So that's really what our range of tolerance is talking about, where those animals can survive, where they can survive best in their optimum range, where they can still survive on either side of that curve, and then where there's no longer a tolerance, there's an intolerance to that particular condition. So a couple factors more that we're going to talk about with biodiversity is species richness and species evenness. So what is that? Let's use these pictures to help us define that. So evenness and richness. Those are two words that we're going to be taking a look at. So if we look at our first community here, we can see that all the trees have about a 25% presence in this community, where community 2 has an 80% presence of tree A, about 5 of tree B, 5 of tree C, and then 10 of tree D. So if we're using those words to what we know, evenness versus richness, I would assign evenness to community 1. We still have a nice proportion of trees here, but they're pretty spread out and they're pretty even within the species. Where richness, we can see there's an abundance of tree A here. So there's still the same amount of trees as community 1, but we have a richness of tree A. So richness is going to be the number of species per sample that is measured of richness. So more species present in the sample, that is a richer sample for that species. So for tree A in community 1, we had a really rich sample of tree A. Where for evenness, it's the measure of relative abundance of different species making up the richness of an area. So again, I want to stress both community 1 and community 2 had the same amount of trees, but we had a richness of tree A in community 2, and we had a nice evenness of an abundance of different species in community 1. So now we're going to start talking about evolution and some of the factors that pull into this. So this man right here is Charles Darwin. He is the founder of this idea of evolution, and because of some studies that he did on the Galapagos Islands. So I want to encourage you to watch these videos to get a better idea of what that is. So he studied finches. So on the Galapagos Islands, they believe that the first finches were blown onto these islands from South America. So we had finches of the same species blown to the Galapagos Islands. So when this happened, we saw that we had the same species, but over a long period of time, these different finches, depending on the food sources and the community environment that they had, they started to form different beaks. So they all started as the same finch, but over time, with the limited food sources and depending on what they had available for resources, they adapted to their surroundings, creating different species of finches on those islands. So that's really where Darwin got his idea for evolution, is that changing of those animals. So let's talk about a couple of the terms that are going to fall into evolution and what we're talking about here. The first one is gene. Gene, so that is a sequence of DNA that codes for a particular trait. So for example, those beaks on the finches, or say in humans, hair color. That's going to be a particular trait. So I have brown hair, so that is the gene that I have. Where gene pool is all of the genes present in the population. So if we take hair color, for example, we know that there are many different colors of hair that can come naturally. So brown, black, blonde, red, all of those different genes would be in our gene pool. And then last one here is biological evolution, and this is a change in the population's gene pool over time. So let's talk about a few factors that can be involved with biological evolution. The first one is mutation. So that is an accidental change in the DNA that can give rise to variation among individuals. So if we take a look right here, we can see there is a mutation happening within this DNA. So it's possible that it changed this brown-haired person to maybe a blonde-haired person. And if that is beneficial, that trait is going to keep being passed on and passed on. So the next term here is migration. So it's the movement of individuals into immigration and out of immigration of a population. So if we take a look here, we're changing the gene pools of these two groups. So if we take a look, we saw a light-colored fish has now joined our striped fish population over here, and it's going to spread its genes. And then over here, we're also going to see our light-colored fish population has a striped fish. So again, there we're going to see an influence in that gene flow in both of these different populations. Two more things here, genetic drift and natural selection. So genetic drift is going to be evolution that occurs by chance. So if we take a look at our picture here, all of these fish have been captured, so they are no longer in the gene pool, where these two fish are now free. So once they are able to reproduce in all those different things, these are the genes that are going to be passed on rather than all of the genes of the fish that were captured. So this is a chance activity that happened, where natural selection is a process by which traits are useful for survival and reproduction. These are going to be passed on, and the ones that are not useful will not be passed on. So if we take a look at our giraffes here, we have a giraffe with a nice long neck, and we have a giraffe with a short neck. Since their food source is at the top of this tree, we're going to see that the long neck is going to be more favorable. So the short neck giraffe is not going to survive in this, and the long neck gene is going to be continually passed on in that population. So that's the difference between genetic drift and natural selection here. So again, I encourage you to really look into these. Natural selection is what Darwin was proving with his finches here. So let's talk about some of these conditions. So the first condition here, organisms produce more offspring. The organisms that produce more offspring are going to be the ones that are surviving and passing those traits on. Individuals vary in some characteristics, which are heritable. So that means like hair color, eye color, things like that. And then finally, individuals vary in fitness or reproductive success. So let's use these mice as an example. So if we take a look here, our mice have a nice dark background that they're living on. So we have a variety of dark mice and light mice. And as we move through our pictures, we're going to see that the mice are eaten by birds, and we can see that all the light mice, or most of the light mice, were taken by the birds. So that left our dark mice to survive because they matched with the background. Because of that, we can see that that is a heritable trait. They are more likely to survive, so they're going to send those genes on to the next generation, and will show that they have more reproductive and fitness than our white mice in this situation. So that's a good example of how natural selection works. Artificial selection, on the other hand, is something a little bit different. This is under human direction. So this means that we are taking it into our own hands to change something about it. So if we take a look at our two examples down here, wolves are the ancestors of dogs. So if we think about that, wolves here, they are the same species as our dogs. And all of these dogs, even though they look very different, are of the same species. So because of that, we have made them look the way that we want to in artificial selection. Same thing here with our plants. We took one plant, we crossbred it and changed its characteristics, and we made some beneficial traits from it. So we made some different types of vegetables here. So that's really what artificial selection is: crossbreeding, taking beneficial traits and trying to put it into another plant. Again, I encourage you to watch some of these videos. But last thing I want to talk about today is speciation. So a process by which new species are generated. So there are many different ways that this can happen, but we're going to talk about one way called allopatric speciation. And here's the steps of how allopatric speciation works. So first we have a single population, and then we see that this single population is geographically isolated from the other side. So we had two little mountains here. We created a nice water here. So now these are separated and cannot breed with each other. And because of that, in the long-term isolation, we're going to see that two different species are going to emerge from that. One that is able to survive in this ecosystem, and one that's able to survive in this ecosystem. So all of those things are going to happen. It's part of natural selection for those animals to start picking up traits that are beneficial for their area. But the act of coming from one single population into those two different, when you're separated by something that is geographical, is going to be allopatric speciation. And this has resulted in pretty much almost all the animals on Earth in the past and today. So it's a really interesting topic here. So if you have any questions, please let me know. I'll see you next time. Oops.